Hi everybody, my name is Kath Dooley. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of South Australia in Adelaide, coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners of the land in Adelaide. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you as part of the 2025 Interactive Film and Media Conference. I'd really like to thank the organisers for giving me this forum to launch my book. It really means a lot to be able to share it with colleagues from all over the world. So I'm going to talk about my book, Virtual Reality Narratives, Embodied Encounters in Space, which was published just last year in around August by Palgrave Macmillan. It's a book that analyses an array of case studies of VR storytelling works that have been released over the last 5 or so years. Before I talk about it a bit more, I thought it'd be useful to talk about the path I took to get to this book, which is very much tied to my previous book, which is called Cinematic Virtual Reality, A Critical Study of 21st Century Approaches and Practices. So cinematic virtual reality is a specific subgenre, I guess, of virtual reality, which is concerned with works that sort of adopt cinema tropes. They're usually narrative in nature, and they have limited interactivity. I was exploring these to write this book here, just coming from my background in screen studies and screen production, and spent a lot of time thinking about what this sort of format offers. But whilst writing this book, I became really interested in the broader spectrum of VR storytelling works that could be seen at film festivals and in other venues and are downloadable online from venues such as the Meta Store. So that led me to the book that I'm talking about today, Virtual Reality Narratives, which looks at a broader spectrum of works, including some cinematic virtual reality, but also immersive theatre works that unfold in VR, things that might be categorized as games, and works that sort of offer combinations of all of the above. So here's a sample of some of the case studies that I give time to in the book. In terms of the motivations for this book, and the one before for that matter, I noticed a number of sort of research gaps in VR storytelling. There were a lot of texts that appeared around 2016, 17 about how to make a VR experience, mainly looking at 360 video. But there were very few books that looked critically at what VR offers as a storytelling medium, and no work that I could see specifically looking at VR as a narrative medium and really digging into multiple case studies to try and pinpoint the specificity of VR as a storytelling medium. I identified 2020 as a key year for the development of VR storytelling, in that this was a year of COVID lockdowns, when there was a huge growth in sales of the Oculus Quest, now known as the Meta Quest headset, as people were spending more time in their homes. It was also a time of experimentation for creators, where they were really developing, I guess, more know-how about what they can do with VR as a storytelling medium. So this book really has been quite a scholarly journey for me into not just screen-based theoretical frameworks, but also looking at game literature, interactive digital narrative, theatre and other areas, to sort of draw concepts that can inform a study of virtual reality narratives. So the key argument for this book is that virtual reality offers a means for the creation of narratives that incorporate the user's body as a storytelling tool. So I consider VR to be an inherently interactive medium, even when considering 360-degree video, which asks you to sort of swivel around in space to look in all different directions. So I argue that the affordances of the medium, which generate a sense of presence in a story world for the user, is unique, and therefore more analysis is needed to understand VR as a narrative format in this context. In terms of my methodology, I take a qualitative approach. So the various chapters include close analysis of VR works, also phenomenological analysis. So I've watched these works repeatedly, taken notes, not just about the sort of formal elements, but also my response as an experiencer of the stories. I also draw upon some production studies as well, interviews with creators, reviews, and looking at industrial stuff that's been written about VR works. I'm interested in a number of theoretical frameworks, ideas drawn from areas like interactive digital narrative, game studies and other areas, as well as ideas that have been generated in industrial context, such as the idea of story living. My introductory chapter, it really begins by charting developments in VR storytelling over the last decade, noting new technologies, new trends for production and distribution. And then it explores the use of the term narrative in various contexts and disciplinary areas. And this begins to draw out narrative theories and discussions that might be related to VR and older media. From then on, I feature 6 chapters, all with a specific focus on some aspect of VR storytelling. So chapter 2, A Body in the Story, seeks to explore the narrative impacts of presence and embodiment in contemporary narrative-based virtual reality projects. And there were 3 case studies for this chapter, which you can see above: The Man Who Couldn't Leave, Stay Alive, My Son, and Please Believe Me. The credits for all of these works featured in this presentation can be found in the reference list at the end of the slides. So in this chapter, I'm really digging into the idea of embodiment, which I define as the feeling of being in or having a body. And I'm asking the question about how this is implicated in VR stories. How does it contribute to the generation of narrative meaning? So I question how interactive devices and stylistic elements, including representations of virtual bodies, give rise to feelings of presence and embodiment. And a formal analysis and phenomenological reading of these 3 projects which offer various bodily representations and degrees of interaction, is presented. So I look at one VR experience that places the user in the body of the main character. That's in the piece called Stay Alive, My Son. Then another that uses generic hands, Please Believe Me. So in this documentary, when you hold out your hands, you see you've just got generic hands that are represented on screen, not a full body. And then The Man Who Couldn't Leave doesn't offer any sort of avatar for the interactor. You're just sort of an invisible presence in this world. So I look at how these varying bodily representations or lack of representation foster degrees of agency for the user. And it's important to note that a lack of agency can also create narrative meaning. And I just refer to an example here from Please Believe Me, the documentary on the end, which is directed by Noni Della Penna, which explores Lyme disease. And as you can see in that image on the right, there's one point where, as the interactor, you look down at your hands and you see that you have a tick on the back of one of your controllers, which is the carrier of Lyme disease. And you might try and sort of flick this off. That was my instinct, but you can't actually, you don't have any agency to do that. And you can only really watch when infection sort of spreads on your hand. So this is just one example where a lack of agency, a lack of, being able to remove objects contributes to the sort of narrative and the experience of that narrative in terms of, communicating what it's like to be infected with Lyme disease. I conclude that the varying approaches to body representation have consequences for the user's sense of identification with a predetermined character, as well as their overall narrative understanding. Chapter 3, Virtual Reality Narration. So this one really looks at documentaries that offer first-person testimony as a way of storytelling. It begins by interrogating the effective communication of first-person testimony in VR experiences by examining the inclusion of voiceover narration and game devices in 3 documentary-based works. And I note that voiceover narration is quite a common formal element of many VR experiences. This is something that I think needs more attention. So in this chapter, I explore these elements with reference to the ideas of voice and focalization, which are 2 key concepts that are explored by the literary theorist 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿. And I reconsider these in terms of 360-degree VR. So I'm also looking at user positioning in relation to other story agents like other characters. In chapter 4, I look at the concept of environmental storytelling techniques in expressive virtual reality documentary. So I should just note that the first 3 of these 6 chapters are really focused on documentary case studies, whereas I then look at some more sort of fictionalized case studies later in the book just noting a bit of a blurring sometimes between those two categories of fiction and non-fiction. So this chapter considers the notion of environmental storytelling for VR through a close reading of 3 room-scale non-fiction projects. So in recent years, considerable academic attention has been directed at 3 360-degree VR documentaries that have adopted the conventions of realist filmmaking. I'm thinking about projects like Clouds over 𝗔𝗀𝘀𝘁𝗿 and lots of sort of lens-based live action VR shorts, a lot of 360 video. But less work has really looked into documentary works that are room scale, that offer 6 degrees of freedom, where you can interact with virtual worlds, and also works that might be more abstract or expressive in the way that they look, so not photographically real. So the concept of environmental storytelling is used as a lens to consider these works. So environmental storytelling is a concept that originated in theme park design and has also been theorized in the context of video games by Henry Jenkins. And it's really about the idea of discovering narrative elements that are built into an environment. So as Jenkins stresses, it's about spatial exploration over causal event chains, which some would argue allows you to be more immersed and be more invested in the story that's unfolding. So I explore this in the context of VR, looking at how meaning might be embedded into an environment, how narrative might be enacted in physical spaces. Now, chapter 5, time, space, and the body in the underpresents. So the underpresents is my favorite virtual reality game. It's several years old now, but I've yet to find one that I like more. So this chapter looks at the effective nature of narrative structures within this game. It's a game that also includes immersive theatre elements. When this game was first launched, and then again later for a short period of time, live actors have appeared in the open world of the game. And as a user in that space, you've been able to actually directly interact with them. So it's an interesting sort of hybrid project. So with reference to narrative theory for games, the chapter explores the underpresents, noting the project's combination of linear story elements, improvised live moments, and open world narrative elements. So I look at how live actors in the game space gives rise to improvised narrative moments. I also look at player-to-player interaction and how this helps narrative to develop. I think this game is a really interesting one because there's a wiki, that's online now and you can read through, and it actually lists some of the players as characters alongside the authored characters. So it really was a space where users could sort of become part of the story. Moving on to chapter 6, between storytelling and story living, so user customization of virtual reality narratives. So this chapter digs into this notion of story living, which gained traction in about 2017 as a way of describing the experience of VR. It's related to a Google News study, so it was a term that emerged from a study of early documentary works. But I pick up this idea and explore it through an analysis of 2 fictional scripted virtual reality projects. So Illustration by New Canvas in 2022 and Fire Escape by Ink Stories in 2019. So these are award-winning works that feature a range of interactive devices such as branching narratives, being able to select your vantage points of the action, other forms of interaction. And there's a lot of personalization and customization that allows the user to actively participate in the process of storytelling. So I'm sort of asking the question, does this equate to story living? How can we think of this sort of interaction in light of the concept of story living? And as an analytical tool in this chapter, I refer to the system, process, and product model of narrative production, which is theorized by Konitz in his book, Interactive Digital Narrative. And I argue that the 2 projects' interactive devices encourage some measure of story living, but that this occurs alongside the delivery of a fully scripted narrative. Moving along to chapter 7, virtual reality narratives live online, immersive theatre in VR chat worlds. This was a really fun chapter to research and write, as I really got really immersed in the history of immersive theatre, and then also the history of theatre that adopts VR as a technology. So the chapter explores recent developments in immersive VR theatre, posing questions about narrative experiences that involve real-time interaction with virtual actors in a VR environment. So the chapter discusses several recent performances that have been staged in VR Chat, which is a social platform where you can enter as an avatar and meet other people, but it's also a venue where people have been conducting these immersive theatre shows. And my central case study is the Severance Theory, Welcome to Respite, which was produced by the US-based Ferryman Collective and Coact Productions in 2021. So this particular project features quite complex game mechanics and visual effects, which encourage the user to interact with live actors and other agents within the context of a story that goes for about 30 to 40 minutes. So the chapter examines the way that Welcome to Respite's narrative is constructed, considering onboarding and offboarding sequences. So by this, I mean the methods by which the performers prepare you to enter and exit the virtual world, as well as the central story itself. So I argue that VR immersive theatre offers the user a personal experience of a pre-authored interactive narrative, which is delivered through live performance, and where one-on-one engagement with actors fosters high levels of engagement and immersion. It also opens up a space for improvisation where the user's actions might shape the narrative in a particular way. So then working through to the conclusion. So the final chapter in the book really reflects on the book as a whole, like all of these individual chapters. What can we take away when we think about them collectively? And I outline some storytelling trends. So what I observe across all of my case studies and more broadly is a real dominance of linear narrative structures in VR storytelling. So despite the fact that it's really an interactive medium, we have still stories that are, quite well mapped out from beginning to end, that are often informed by Aristotelian patterns of narrative, the idea of cause and effect driving the narrative, and attempting to create an experience of catharsis for the interactor. This is what Mary Law Ryan refers to as top-down systems of interactive digital narrative, or an example of that, where really, even when the sort of interactive elements, the user is going down a path that's been carefully sort of crafted by the author of the work. And it might be that there's branching narratives, there might be multiple paths, but it's not really possible for the user to deviate from any of these paths. I note, though, that VR live theatre or VR video games with open worlds do offer opportunities for what Ryan would call bottom-up narrative systems, where there is more opportunity for, emergent narratives. In the conclusion, I outline 3 key themes which emerge across the chapters. And these are, firstly, VR as spatialized storytelling. I note how VR projects really engage their audiences via the distribution of information across all quadrants of 360-degree space. I also sort of summarize user-focused approaches to narration, digging into ideas around narrators, user positioning, and point of view. And lastly, I provide a summary around virtual reality as interactive digital narrative. The case studies in the book really demonstrate VR's specificity as a form of interactive digital narrative, so a sort of form in its own right. This specificity relates to the affordances of VR technology, which give rise to the interactor's immersion in a virtual environment. So this sense of immersion that's fostered by the technology, I argue, is different to the idea of narrative immersion that you might have when you're reading a book or, watching a film, where you just sort of get carried away by the story, immersed in the story. So we have this in VR, but we also have the immersion that's fostered by the technology. So we need to consider how both of these things are at play. I argue that we can observe continued tensions between interactivity and the delivery of a coherent narrative in VR, which has long been a key challenge outlined by scholars in working in the area of interactive digital narrative. A discussion of these themes foregrounds the way that VR harnesses the user's body as a storytelling tool and really demands the full bodily engagement of the user. And this is particularly evident in works that feature a physical body representation or avatar for the user, which functions as a replacement for their real body. In these cases, the digital avatar allows the user to contribute to narrative threads through bodily movement, engagement with the story agents like other characters or objects, meaning the actions are unfolding in real time and can meaningfully influence the progression of the narrative. And this consideration of the user's body as a storytelling tool really calls for consideration of accessibility and inclusion issues. Unfortunately, most VR experiences are designed for people that are able-bodied, and this is something that I dig into a bit in that final chapter. So that's pretty much an overview of the book. I hope that that is useful and interesting, and I look forward to talking more about it in person with people as part of the conference. Thanks very much.